Now that the channel assignments are known, we can come back into INAV and connect to the flight controller and go down to the Modes tab. This is where we can set all our flight modes, and we want to control these modes from the different switches that we've assigned to the different channels. So I'm just going to step through each one of these one at a time, talk about what they are, and set them up. When you come in here, this may or may not be set to hide unused modes by default. Right now, since we're configuring the modes, I would suggest turning this off so that we can see them all. Right now, there are no modes that are used, so we're seeing them all, but I think as soon as we define one, all the other unused ones will disappear. So it's just easier if we just set this off to begin with. So the first item here is to arm the system. Now, when you arm an aircraft, what that says is that the motors are hot. You're basically turning on, you're engaging the motors so that the transmitter will now respond to the throttle. So it's kind of a safety feature. You want to stand clear of the prop. Whether you're flying a quad rotor or a fixed wing aircraft, you just want to be aware that your aircraft is hot and ready to go. So to do that, I need to drive that from the switch that I set up for my arming switch, and that's this switch up here.
Disarmed, armed, disarmed.
So that is on channel 5, and if I click add range here, it comes up with channel 5 by default. So you can see this little blue tick mark right here. That's where the switch is currently set. If I set it to the mid position, you can see that the tick moved into here within range of this blue bar here, which enabled the arm mode. So you can see this is dark blue now, dark something. And if I then switch to the third position, it fell out of arm mode. So it's disarmed. I have, like I said, I have this switch configured for return to home, which you may not want to do that, especially if you're configuring something for ELRS. Maybe it's not a good idea to have two functions on your arm switch, but that's the way I have it set up. But when I go into return to home, I don't want to disarm the aircraft. So I'm going to extend this range here all the way to the end. So now it remains armed in either of these two switch positions.
Armed.
And then when I
disarmed.
Switch it this way, it disarms. And I have these audio messages programmed in here, so it tells me verbally what setting I've just enabled. The next one here is pre-arm. I am not familiar with that, so I'm going to skip that. I don't use it. I think it's just another level of arming safety. I haven't looked into what it is, what it's for. It may be primarily for quad rotors versus fixed wing aircraft, but I think it just has something to do with an extra level of safety. So this section here is now titled Flight Modes, and these are the 3 primary flight modes that your aircraft can fly in. Angle mode is kind of a stabilized flight mode where it won't allow you to perform any adverse maneuvers. You can't do any acrobatics. If you notice down here at the bottom, there's this blue acro indicator here to indicate that normally by default the aircraft is in acro mode. Acro mode is kind of an acrobatic mode where it will allow you to do things like loops and rolls and whatnot. Whereas angle mode has limitations on how steeply you can bank your aircraft and whatnot. Horizon mode is similar to angle mode. I don't recall what the distinction is, but they're very similar, and you can look in the documentation for INAV to sort that out if you want. Currently, I'm not using horizon mode. I like to fly in angle mode. It's a nice stabilized mode. Or I'll switch it to manual mode. Manual mode is as if you don't have a flight controller in your aircraft. It's just as if you had a receiver and a radio on a normal airplane. Manual mode is where you want to fly during your maiden flight to get your trims set up to make sure the airplane is flying correctly in manual mode, because once you get everything dialed in, then your flight controller can optimize its flight characteristics. So I want to set a switch for angle mode here. That would be this switch here in the center position.
Angle mode.
So this is the position I normally fly in. And I like to set all my switches by default to their center position for the most part, except for the arming switch. So I want to define a range to enable angle mode. And this switch SB is on channel 7, as we saw from a previous video. So if I go here and select channel 7, you can see now this tick mark is somewhere near the middle.
Loiter. Angle mode.
I think I have a different range programmed in the radio, and this is some advanced thing we can look at later on. So you can see that it's not going all the way to 2000. The center
Angle
point
mode.
is not at 1500. It's down here like 13 something. And then
Loiter.
this mode isn't even quite 1000. So I've got a limited range in here for some reason. And I think it's to do some fancy
Angle mode.
control setup that I won't even get into right now. So this I want to set to something like 1225. Come on. 1225 to 1500. So I'm going to slide this over to 1500. So this falls in kind of the mid-range of the range where I want angle mode to be. So now if I switch
Loiter.
to some other
Angle
mode,
mode.
it now falls outside.
Angle mode. Loiter.
So it only enables
Angle
angle
mode.
mode when I'm in the angle mode position. So this switch has 3 functions on it: angle mode,
Loiter.
loiter,
Manual mode.
and manual mode.
Angle mode.
So I'm going to skip horizon mode because I'm not using that. So let's come down to the manual mode. So I want to set that to be a range
Manual mode.
for this switch setting. So I want to add a range here. Again, that's still channel 7. And I want to set this to something like 1750. And by the way, as I move these, you can see the range setting here, min and max. And I'll set the min to something like 1575. Make it a nice narrow range. So the switch has to be in this position to enable that. And you can see that the throw
Angle
isn't
mode.
very much.
Angle
It's not spanning this whole 2 millisecond or 2.1 millisecond span here. So it's going between here, here, and somewhere over here. So now if I scroll back up a little bit, you can see that it's switching into angle mode in this position. It switches out of angle mode and into manual mode in this position.
Loiter.
And then up here, it drops out of both of those modes and goes into another mode we haven't configured yet. Well, that's the next one I want to configure. Nav course hold. Okay, well, first of all, we're now into navigation modes. These modes, you really only want to set one at a time. These are navigation modes that tell the flight controller to fly your aircraft. And there's various different modes that we can choose from. Course hold is one mode. I don't know the particulars of a lot of these. I'm only currently using loiter and return to home. I've used cruise mode. Basically, if you set your airplane heading in a certain direction at a certain altitude and switch it to cruise mode, the flight controller will retain those settings and just fly off into the sunset along that heading as long as it's in cruise mode. So I'm going to skip nav course hold and nav cruise mode and go straight to nav loiter. So that's this position here on the SB
Angle mode. Loiter.
switch mode. And you can see here that it said loiter. So I want to add a range here. And again, it's channel 7 because we're still on that same switch. And I'm going to set this range to something like 900 to 1200. So it falls in there. So you can see when I switch it
Angle mode.
back to angle mode, it falls out of loiter mode. So now I have all 3 positions defined for this switch. So we're done with channel 7.
Angle mode.
I'll switch that back to my normal position. Now the next one I want to define is NAV RTH, which is return to home. So in this mode, the aircraft will fly itself back to the home location as saved from the GPS settings at the time that you armed your aircraft. So I want to add a range here, and this, as I mentioned earlier, is on my arming switch, which is on channel 5. Well, I don't want it armed. I don't want it in return to home mode there.
Return to launch.
I want it into return to home mode here. So I'm going to change the range to span somewhere outside of there, 1750 to 2100. You can see now that return to home is enabled. And we saw earlier that it's still armed. So we haven't disarmed, but now we're in return to home. And I can switch out of return to home, disarm. So now we're done with channel 5. We've got all of those switch positions defined. NAV WP is when you're flying a waypoint mission. You can program a waypoint mission in here, which I'm not even going to cover in this series. That's something I want to look into in the future because that's something I really want to do. But enabling this option will put the flight controller into waypoint mode to execute that mission. So you can program a mission in and then kick it off by throwing a switch to put it into NAV waypoint mode. GCS nav, I think that's new because I don't recognize it. I have no idea what it is. So I'm going to skip that. So now we come to a group of modes which are flight mode modifiers. So depending on what flight mode you're in, you can enable one of these to augment that mode. Nav altitude hold, if you put it there, it will try to retain its current altitude. And I'm actually not using that one. Heading hold. So I think actually cruise mode includes altitude hold and heading hold. I think it's a combination setting. So you don't need to explicitly enable these if you're using cruise mode. But you can use these to modify any other mode. So I'm not using that. Soaring, I'm not sure. That's probably for sailplanes, I imagine. I'm not using that. I haven't looked into that, so I don't know what it does. So I'm going to skip that. Turn assist, I'm also going to skip because I also am not familiar with that one. And I'm not using it. So now we get into the fixed wing grouping. And these are the options that you can do to auto tune your aircraft. And I want to use this. I have a switch on SA here for auto tune, and then I have this position here. There wasn't a voice file for that for auto level, but it just says auto. So I want to have auto tune on this setting and auto level trim on this setting. So let's add a range here for auto tune. And that's on channel 6. I've routed that SA switch to channel 6. So let's select that. And we can see that it is responding. But I want it to respond to the upper setting. So I'm going to extend this range over here and narrow it up to, say, 1200. So now I can enable auto tune by putting the switch in that position. Similarly, I'm going to come down to the auto level trim and set a range over on channel 6. I'm going to set this range from, say, 1800 to 2100, if this computer will allow me. So now if I switch the switch in the down position, it enables auto trim mode. Back to the center position, which is my normal default. We'll move on. Loiter change, I don't know what that does. It would be useful if this page had little help icons that you could mouse over or click to get information on what all these modes do. But again, you can refer to the INAV documentation to get that information. So I'm going to skip the loiter change and go down to OSD modes. I do have alternative OSD displays, so I want to configure this. One of the options I have is to turn the OSD off, and I do that with this switch. If I put this switch down in the down position, that turns the OSD off, clears my screen, so I have a clear view in my goggles. So I want to add a range here, and this is on channel 10. SD is mapped to channel 10, and in the down position, I want to go, this must be backwards, unless I didn't write down the complete configuration that I had for OSD. So this should be OSD off. So I'm going to set that to OSD off if this computer will allow me. So I'm going to set that somewhere over here. So in this position, OSD is off. In this position, I want the alternative OSD, so I'm going to add a range here, set it to channel 10, and I'm okay with that range there. And then the normal OSD will be displayed in this position, so we don't want this to activate anything. So we're only overriding the default when we switch into one of these other positions. So this is my alternative OSD view, and then this is turning the OSD off. I only have these two options. You can define up to 2 more alternative OSD views, but I'm not using them, so I'm going to move on beyond them. Now, I don't have a smart camera, or at least if I do, I don't utilize the features, so I'm not going to implement any of these camera modes here, but there are 4 camera modes here, and just like me, you'll have to explore on your own if you're interested in following through with that. So I'm going to skip those and move on down to miscellaneous modes. Now, in my auxiliary switch over here, I have, in the down position, I enable the beeper. And that will make the flight controller beep. Right now, I don't have a battery plugged into the flight controller. I'm just driving it off the USB connector. So I don't think that makes it beep. Maybe I have it turned off. I will turn the beeper on and try it. Yeah. So the beeper only works, I guess. Oh, well, I haven't enabled the beeper mode. Duh. So let's go in here and add a range. And this is on channel 9 because SC has been mapped to channel 9. And I'm going to make that over on this range here with the switch down. I'm wanting to swear at this thing. I'll go like 1800 to 2100. And so now, if I switch it down, it's now in the beeper mode. Now let's see if this is turned on or off. Yeah, it doesn't work in just the USB mode. But if I had a battery attached to my airplane, you would hear that beeping very loud. Now I also have a secondary option on this switch for
Black box active.
black box. Black box is the black box data recorder. I am not doing a home reset. That lets you select an alternate home position in flight. I believe if you activate that, it will set your home position to wherever your airplane is at the time. Don't quote me on that, but that's my assumption. WP planner is a waypoint planner. I don't really know what that is either. Mission change, I'm not sure what that does either. That has something to do with the waypoint missions. So I'm just going to jump down here to black box and enable a range for that. And that's again on channel 9. I'm going to set this to our upper range here where the switch is currently set. 900 to, I don't know. I'm really not liking this mouse pad. So we set the black box there and we're all set. Now we're done with this switch. We have our desired settings and can move on from there. Now, failsafe is used basically if your flight controller loses contact with the ground station. You can assign a switch to failsafe, and if I want to, I have a spare switch here, so I could do that. I could assign failsafe to the SG switch, and I don't know. There's probably a compelling reason to have that set on a switch, but I've never set it on a switch. I let failsafe handle failure conditions. I don't want to invoke a failure condition, but maybe it's good to test your failsafe by having a switch. So you can define the switch and then later remove that definition if you want to test failsafe. I did an in-flight test of failsafe accidentally by turning my radio off. Well, my radio locked up and I had to turn it off. So that was my test. Rearming your aircraft in flight is an interesting procedure too. So maybe it's a good thing to practice that. So maybe you want to add a switch to engage failsafe on demand so that you can practice recovery. That might be one compelling reason to set one up. But I'm not setting one up. Kill switch, I'm not sure what that is. That might be for internal combustion engine use. I don't know. Maybe it kills the motors as well. I have no idea. So I'm not using that one. Now, if we look at the user documentation for the Maytech flight controller that I'm using, which is the F405WMN, there is some information there for how to configure the camera switch, to switch between the two cameras. And that uses this user 2 setting. So there's like 4 user definable switches here that you can, I don't know if you can explicitly define something or create something, but this Maytech company who made this flight controller implemented user 2 to do their camera switching. So I want to set up a range here on user 2 to switch between the cameras using this switch up here. This is switch F. Switch F is mapped to channel 8. So I want to select the channel 8 here. And I want to set that range to the upper range. Sorry for this painful dragging operation. Miserably painful. So I'm setting it up there. You can see that this switch goes from one extreme to the other, so this range is acceptable. I could narrow that up even if I wanted to. How narrow you make these is up to you, but I just like to give it some breathing room just in case there's any fluctuation in the signal and you get a different reading or something. But now you can see that in this mode, user 2 is not enabled. In this mode, user 2 is enabled. So that triggers something inside the flight controller that enables the camera to switch to the other camera. That's pretty much it, except for one advanced thing that I want to set up. By the way, there's other options here that we haven't looked at, and I haven't looked at them either, so I'm not even going to look at them now. But I want to go back up to angle mode because there's a bit of a problem here. These auto-tune modes, we have auto-tune and auto-trim, are set up to work in one of these flight modes, I believe. And this is the reason that I set this up, so that's why I believe that. I read it somewhere. But I want these auto-tune and auto-trim modes to work in angle mode. Or at least I want the auto-tune to work in angle mode. So when I switch auto-tune, I don't want it coming out of angle mode. Wait a minute. I think I may be... Yeah, that's right, because this is channel 6. So I can add a second range to this. So I can use channel 6 to also enable angle mode. Now, channel 6 also, well, I'll get to that after I set this up. But I want this to be in angle mode actually when I'm doing the auto trim. So in the auto trim mode, I'm going to set this range, holy crap. So frustrating. So channel 6 will now enable angle mode. Now, if you noticed, when I switched channel 7, it also affected, or channel 6, when I switched this channel 6, it also affected channel 7 here, because you can see this channel 7 bumped up into this range. So if I was in manual mode and I switched into an auto tune, it takes it out of manual mode. It also, if I'm in angle mode and I switch to auto tune, it would have taken it out of angle mode, but I've enabled angle mode on channel 6. But now if I go to auto tune mode, again, it also bumps channel 7 out. So it's taking angle mode out and setting acro mode effectively. If you notice, if I'm in angle mode or manual mode, acro mode disables. So these flight modes can be only one at a time. But if I'm here in auto tune, it's taken it out of angle mode and it's forced it out of manual mode, and it's now in acro mode because auto tune needs to run in acro mode. So that's what it was. Auto tune runs in acro mode. Auto trim, I run that in angle mode. So somewhere in my configuration in my radio, and we can take a look at that in a separate video, I have overridden channel 7 with channel 6. And maybe that's something I should do through the flight controller. We can look at that when we get to programming. In fact, that's what I'll do. And I might change it so that I don't set it up in my radio, but I set it up in the flight controller instead. We'll see if we can do that. But now we've got all our switches set up to control the flight controller as desired. So now what you really want to do at this point is save. Make sure you save your changes. And you'll see a message up here. It says EEPROM saved. So all these settings are getting saved into EEPROM, which is a different type of non-volatile memory where it saves these settings. And it doesn't require a reboot. I don't know why some of these other options do. But now that we are done with this, we're free to move on. So as usual, remember to disconnect.